So thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. My name's Nick Plumb. I'm Director of Policy and Insight at Power to Change. And we're here today to discuss new research published by Power to Change today, co-authored by Josh Westling, our Policy Manager, Linda Hien, our Insight Manager, and myself. For those that don't know Power to Change, we are a think and do tank focused on community business and creating conditions for community businesses to operate well. And this work is part of our community power strand of work. So what are we here to discuss? So really, we are, with this research and this panel, we wanted to think about the declining trust in politics that feels like such a feature of our society today. Numerous bits of polling and research from organisations like the National Centre for Social Research and all sorts of pollsters have shown this declining trust in politics and democracy and show it to be at a real low point. We're also interested in the work of the late Peter Mayer, political scientist who did work to look at the growing gap between political parties and civil society. Something that he'd observed over decades across Western Europe, and I think that's a feature of British politics today. So Power to Change set out to really try and explore that. So this declining trust in politics, this growing void between civil society and politics, how could we think about bringing those two things together in through some research? And that's what led us to this Closing the Void piece of work. How could this void, has this void between citizens and politics really kind of accelerated the decline in trust in democracy? And if we were to try and close that void, could we go some way to rebuilding that trust? And I think it's all the more pertinent to be talking about this now, given the election results last week, where we saw the Reform Party do incredibly well across local authority election results, combined authorities, the Runcorn by-election, the Reform Party kind of giving the established political parties a real kicking, I would say. So that's the kind of context for this discussion. Just want to run through how we're going to go about this afternoon, and then I'll introduce our really excellent panelists. So we're going to kick off firstly with a short presentation from Josh and Linda to talk through the research, to give everyone the kind of the detail that we've uncovered on this question. And then we're going to go to our panelists, Deborah, Charlotte, and Mark, for their reflections on the research, and then we'll have space for audience Q&A. So if you have questions for panelists that are coming up as you're listening to them, or for Josh and Linda as they're presenting, please do post those in the Q&A section. Better there than the chat, because we'll be able to kind of monitor those questions and get to them in an orderly manner. So without further ado, I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists, and then I'll pass to Deborah first, who's going to kick us off. So many of you'll know Deborah Mattinson. She's political strategist, entrepreneur, leading voice in public opinion. She was one of the people that helped mastermind Labour's 2024 election victory and has been a central player in British politics for over 30 years, and a newly minted member of the House of Lords. Next up, we've got Mark Steers, who is the director of the UCL Policy Lab, longtime friend of Power to Change. Mark is an academic, political strategist, speechwriter, was chief speechwriter to Ed Miliband during his time as Labour leader. And Charlotte Hollins is founder and general manager of the Ford Hall Community Land Initiative, which is England's first community-owned farm. They have a community membership of over 8,000. And Charlotte is also one of 8 leaders of working on the We're Right Here campaign, the campaign for community power. So really looking forward to hearing from all of them. But first up, I'm going to pass to Josh and Linda, who are going to run us through the research.
Great, thanks very much, Nick, and thanks to the panel and for you all for joining us today. We'll try to keep things fairly brief in this section so that we have as much time for discussion as possible. But yeah, in terms of the poll findings, kind of acting on that argument that Nick was setting out well, we did find that when someone's a member of at least one associational organisation, that is associated with greater trust, both in government, but also in political parties as well. We found that greater involvement is associated with higher trust, so they're only really kind of being a bigger kind of trust dividend once you have someone who's involved in three or more organizations. And Lucy, if we could just move on a couple of slides. We also see that deeper involvement is associated with higher trust. So that's when someone's taking a really active role in these organizations, such as being an organizer or a leader. That's where you see a real difference compared to if someone's just a member. In terms of who's involved in these organizations, actually quite a lot of us get involved in associational organizations. You could say we're a nation of clubs. Just over half of us get involved with these organizations, though you do see this kind of U-shaped curve related to age, particularly with kind of caring responsibilities coming in middle life. We also find that the type of organization matters. So there's an inverse relationship between the size of membership within the general population and the impact that it has on trust. So the organizations that not as many people are a part of, but you might have a more active and engaged membership, say a PTA, has a bigger impact on trust than those organizations where you might more passively join, which I'm sure many of us on this call have done so at points. Then moving to look at More in Common's 7 segments. Like, unsurprisingly, here you find that most kind of typically politically engaged segments are the ones who have both higher trust but also higher engagement. I think there is something interesting here in that context that Nick was alluding to, where the two traditionally dominant parties, their core vote is beginning to look shaky, perhaps at best, and whether associational organisations might be a route through which you can reach those voters. I think also looking at the loyal nationals is interesting here, in that they have relatively high engagement but exhibit relatively low trust, and this voter group being the one associated with the red wall that kind of defined politics in the last in the 2019 general election, and to an extent at the last one. This might be a route whereby traditional parties might be able to win back the trust of that group. And finally, in all this, we're conscious that lots of things kind of affect people's engagement with associational organisations. So More in Common ran a regression analysis and did find that engagement is statistically significantly associated with higher levels of political trust, even when you control for demographic factors. That being said, as you can see here, in some cases that boost in trust is small or non-existent, whereas for other organisations it's a much larger boost. So I'll now pass to Linda, who will give an overview of the focus groups.
Thanks, Josh. So our focus group set out to explore these polling findings in more detail, and in particular to explore whether there were any mechanisms within associational organisations that might support there being a higher level of satisfaction in democracy and higher trust in political institutions. So we held 4 focus groups. 2 groups were with leaders of community businesses, 1 was with leaders of associational organisations, and 1 was with members of associational organisations. And there were a diverse range of these organisations represented, including residents' associations, work unions, and voluntary groups. And unsurprisingly, the focus groups gave us a bit more of a complex picture of the connection between people and politics and how trusting leaders and members of these organizations are. And if you ask people directly, they'll be quite quick to showcase skepticism and widespread distrust. And that aligns with this decline in trust in national politics that we've been seeing. But we also saw in the focus groups that associational organizations included markers for political behavior and engagement, which could provide a stepping stone to increase trust. So our first finding here is that associational organisations can provide opportunities for citizens to reconnect to politics. And there were lots of examples in the focus groups of involvement within local politics. So, for example, organisations hosting hustings or negotiating with councillors, or councillors pushing forward their plans in their organisations. So direct engagement with local politics did at times lead to, among associational organisation members and leaders, greater awareness of political processes, sometimes sympathy towards politicians and the challenges that they faced, or sometimes even kind of themselves a consideration to be involved in governance roles or local politics. So we have a sense that these interactions can kind of break down those barriers between politics and ordinary people, and help to close the void in this way. If we go on to the next slide. We also found that associational organisations have an alternative conception of local politics that isn't just connected to the local council or local MPs, but actually is belonging to citizens and the community themselves. So this quote, for example, shows how politics, local politics, is about people coming together and changing things where they are locally. We can posit this alternative conception as another mechanism of associational involvement that can connect the political with the ordinary citizen. And this quote from the community business leader in London showcases that they didn't actually take a step back from politics through their kind of organizational involvement, but actually became reconnected to political processes. We also posited early on in our argument that there would be internal kind of levers within associational organisations that can help to close the void. And we saw this a lot in our focus group. So there are 2 kind of great examples of how this worked. The first is in community business leaders who regarded their spaces as places in which members of the community could see that they could make small changes in their environment and could have greater agency, greater voice, which could then be used to re-engage them in political processes that matters. So this quote kind of shows how someone asked for a pool table in the area. The next week they got a pool table, and that could be kind of showcasing how they do have the power and they do have decision-making power. Another example shows how a leader of a work union had developed listening skills on their job, and this translated to them being more open to and listening to local politicians who came to visit them. So both great examples of how democratic levers involved in associational organisations could help to drive a reconnection to politics. And finally, we found that these associational organisations with these kind of mechanisms naturally lend themselves well to being spaces of respectful in-person connection across different kind of party affiliations, not only because people of all different backgrounds were joining together and having these discussions really naturally, but because organisational leaders, particularly some community business leaders, had already started to organise their spaces in a way that could help to enable this respectful discussion. So, for example, having house rules put into place so that people could disagree well with each other across different kind of ideologies and affiliations. And often those spaces have been set up quite deliberately to counteract what leaders saw as division and aggression on social media, and division being sown between different communities. And often those spaces did involve those who are more distrusting and disillusioned. So there's a real importance there of these organisations in bridging higher trust across different party and political lines. So the overall picture is that of kind of widespread skepticism, but associational organisations through the polling, through the focus groups, do offer these opportunities to close the void. I'll pass back to our chair now.
Thank you so much, Linda. Josh, kind of fairly rapid canter through the research there, but I think what I'm taking from that is that there is this kind of significance between levels of trust in politics and associational organizations and all their forms, and something there about the role that they play and how that can connect people back into politics. That I think, Linda, you set out really nicely, that it is a kind of complex and nuanced picture as well. So hopefully we can get into discussing some of the implications of that through the course of this discussion. So Deborah, I was hoping you could kick us off by reflecting a little bit on the fact that this kind of record low levels of public trust in politics has come through in this polling and all sorts of other bits of research in recent years, and how much you feel that actually shapes party strategy on the ground, but also what can't polling tell us that influences that as well.
Sure, yeah, and yes, and thanks all for, I mean, I think it's a very interesting piece of work, and it certainly got me thinking, and I shared it actually straight away with number 10, who said, yeah, yes, actually, we have been sent it, although they hadn't read it, and I said I thought they should. So there you are. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, trust is the $64,000 question. It's a huge problem. I think you're right to say it connects very directly to, the sorts of results that we were seeing a week ago, which are obviously very worrying, where people are basically rejecting mainstream politics. We've seen it in Germany. We've seen it in America. It's a bit of a recurring pattern. One thing I would say is I do think trust is a very high bar. And I'm not sure it's quite the right question to ask. No organization, political party, company, whatever, is trusted per se very well, and probably never have been. I mean, I realize there's a sort of downward shift that we're aware of, but actually, I kind of think it's, what are you asking people if they trust you for? Are they trusting you to deliver? Are they trusting you to understand their concerns? I think you have to kind of dig a little bit deeper, but be that as it may, we've obviously got trend data that shows that however the question's asked, it's got worse, and that's clear. And I think it's very interesting to think that there is obviously some sort of correlation in civil activity and breaking down that trust problem. Although I do think the data needs some interrogation, to be honest. I think if we look at those people who are motivated, there is a case for saying they're the people who would have been motivated anyway, because what about those groups that the sort of the two disengaged groups? They don't look to me to be moving very far up either of the graphs that you showed. And I think it would definitely be worth doing some follow-up work that just looked at them. I also think not all of the organizations and the kinds of involvement are equal. So I think joining a football team is not the same as volunteering in your local old folks' home. Joining the National Trust is not the same as becoming a community activist. And I think that needs to be sort of picked through too, because, I think it is about how involved you actually are in the kind of organization you're involved with. And that was sort of ironed out a little bit in the data and needs a little bit more understanding. But let's take it at face value and assume that it's broadly right. I think you then have to ask why. And to my mind, this is about two things really. It's about building your knowledge and understanding of the world around you and connection to it. And it's about a kind of engagement, a kind of emotional engagement, which is why it's quite important. Just joining the National Trust, I don't think ticks the box, which is why you saw it at the bottom of your pile. And I think it's really important to understand a little bit more about what it is that's forcing that connection, assuming that it exists. And as I say, I would be focused on two groups. I'd be focused on young people, who we know are less engaged and more likely to be you know, sucked into the world of social media and on their phones and so on. And I would also focus on those two groups, the disengaged traditionalists and the disengaged battlers. And with that in mind, and kind of looking at your proposals, which I also think are very interesting, I think for political parties, it makes the case for them doing more community activity themselves. And when I've seen this work on the ground, it works incredibly well. And I think it's about get out there and fill the potholes rather than getting out there and filling a church hall with a load of people talking to themselves. You know, I think there are things that political parties could be doing to organise locally that would get them seen in local communities and get them out there. On what government can do, I think it's quite difficult because a lot of things you propose cost a lot of money, and we know what the issues are here. I mean, for example, I'd always been a fan of the kind of the national service type community service young people thing, and I know that happened in a very low key way. It never happened properly because it was simply too expensive to do. But I do think it might be worth looking at tax breaks for organisations that allow the kind of community involvement that you're proposing. Yeah, I'm conscious we haven't got much time and I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to stop so you can bring in some other people.
Thanks so much, Deborah. Yeah, loads to mull over there, and I think particularly that point around how some of this sort of stuff works for people that are naturally more disengaged, and how you provide that bridge into civic life, which then may connect
It
them.
doesn't work
Yeah.
otherwise if you're, you know,
Yeah.
you're just sort of preaching to the choir.
I wondered, Charlotte, just as a follow-up on that point, whether you think from your work with the Fordall Farm, whether there are things that politicians and policymakers might learn from the way that your community-led projects build trust and encourage participation, because I know you'll be working with some people that are hyper-engaged and others that you might find hard to reach, but bring into that sort of space.
Yeah, definitely. And we do have all levels of engagement. And actually, I think some of Deborah's points are really valid. And I think trust comes with connections and relationship building. And I think that's the key aspect of it. And that comes when we listen to each other. And it comes when we open up decision making and share that process with people in a really meaningful way. And I think, you know, the way that we do that with our members is by asking for help on a regular basis, and offering lots of different ways and mechanisms that people can engage with the process, and making sure that retains really open. So whether people are kind of excited to have their voice heard, or are a bit shy or disempowered and kind of not sure that it's their space, but actually I really appreciate being asked, and kind of try and provide them mechanisms that allow people to engage and support the Fordall Community Land Initiative in lots of different ways. And that we've seen over our lifespan of kind of nearly 20 years in community ownership is what's seen people empowered. So it could be that they've donated some time. It could be that they've gone, actually, I'll just send you a bit of money because I know that you're going to put that to good use. It's been because they've shared their voice in the surveys, because they've put themselves forward to be a board of director. It's because they've been advocates for us. It's because they've sent us some buttons to help us kind of sew our yurts together. Actually, it's the key to it has been the diversity of that engagement around listening to all those people, making sure they understand that each of their voices is heard at a really personal level, and providing opportunities to build that relationship and that trust. And as a result of that, kind of, we've got a membership that are kind of coming back to us now going, thanks for asking us these questions, but we trust you to make the right decisions, and we know that you're going to do that.
Great. Thank you, Charlotte. I'll come back to you in a second, Charlotte, for kind of slightly longer reflection, but I just wondered, Mark, whether you had any further reflections on that point Deborah was making around the kind of filling potholes versus filling church holes, and the ways that political parties kind of historically or currently engage with community organisations. I know you had some role in that at the Labour Party.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much, everyone. Wonderful to be here, and great work, as everyone has said. I mean, I think Deborah is absolutely on the money in that regard, and it reminded me of a conversation I recently had with one of my gurus, Hari Khan, the American academic, who's just written this wonderful book called Undivided. And in that book, Hari says, look, the problem of politics at the moment is like twofold. First of all, it's become sort of spectacle rather than participation. So you're not invited to do anything; you're just invited to watch it. And secondly, the spectacle's not very good. So you're being invited to watch a TV show or a movie with sort of unconvincing actors who are largely shouting at each other about things that you're not very interested in, or speaking in some sort of strangulated prose, which we'll come back to talk about later. But that strikes me as absolutely right. It's like, it would be one thing if, instead of giving us the opportunities to do things on the ground, politics was putting on a brilliant show and delivering for us, from the center. We might think, well, it's a shame that we don't have that community participation angle, but at least we're getting nice shiny new schools and hospitals and all sorts of lovely things from the government. But in fact, we seem to have lost both. We seem to have lost the opportunity to engage at a local level, participatory level, get on and do those local things like fill the potholes. And the show that's been put on instead is pretty uncompelling or uninteresting to the vast majority of people. And that's a double whammy, which just leaves those trust levels on the floor, as you've spoken about, Nick.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, really good points. Charlotte, I'm going to come to you, particularly to reflect on any kind of legislative change that you think might help deepen community engagement. No, that's something that you're kind of deeply involved in with the We're Right Here campaign.
Yeah. So the We're Right Here campaign is calling for a number of legislative changes, including the community right to shape public services and the community right to manage investment, along with the community right to buy, which is kind of coming through. And the mechanism which has been suggested of kind of putting those community right around shaping public services and managing investment forward is around community covenants, which are kind of neighbourhood level power sharing agreements between the local authority and the community, where decision making is made equally at that kind of base neighbourhood level. It's a place where kind of communities can listen to each other, it's supportive, it's inclusive, where we share our voice, the needs and the resources within our community, we're empowering each other, we're acting kindly, but most importantly, we're making decisions together in the best interests of our community. And I'm really lucky to be trialling a pilot project in Market Drayton. We've created the Market Drayton Rural Parishes Community Covenant with Shropshire Council, where we've got parish councillors, town councillors, but also nearly 20 community organisations as part of this covenant group, from the churches, schools, sports groups, libraries, community organisations, community farms like ourselves, that have come together to help shape public services in our local area with devolved decision making that's been gifted to us from Shropshire Council. And it's been a really great pilot. We're still working through it. We're working on a community and family hub in our local area, and it's been really enthusiastically received both by the community and by the local authority. And we haven't needed legislation to make it happen, but that relationship, that opportunity doesn't exist everywhere. Not every council is open to the same level of collaboration. Not every council listens to the voice of the community in the same way and prepared to put the time in, and it is a decent amount of time, or have the knowledge of how to do it in the right way. And I think that's one of the reasons why the We're Right Here campaign is really pushing for legislation to kind of bring things like community covenants into place that support neighbourhood level decision making in a structural, accountable and equitable approach. That means that when communities want that facility is there for them to take forward, and we can build that relationship with our kind of local authorities and communities. And hopefully at the end of it, we're ending up with better decisions that are made more efficiently, that make more use of not just council resources, but also the resources that we have within our community. And hopefully long term, it's a more invested decision from the wider community as well.
Thank you, Charlotte. Loads of such powerful learning from the pilot work you're doing in Shropshire. I wondered, Mark, just coming to you, and maybe Deborah, if you've got thoughts on this as well. Like, I guess one of the things that we've been aware of through this research, but kind of through lots of the work that Power to Change does, is whether there is a bit of a tension between kind of top-down lawmaking, legislation, bottom-up democratic energy. And so I wondered, Mark, what role do you think the state should play in nurturing associational life? We've set forward a couple of ideas, but throughout this, there's been kind of internal discussion and debate as to whether that ends up kind of impacting that democratic energy. So maybe come to you first, Mark and Deborah.
Yeah, I think it's a really important question for everyone on the call, really. I mean, it's always struck me, you know, for a very long time now, that there should be a division of labour here, that you don't want government or the state trying to do things that, you know, local people are better placed to do themselves, or community groups are better than do themselves. On the other hand, you do want government to be acting to support by building the infrastructure and facilitating the possibilities for that kind of action. And that division of labour is quite a complicated one, but I think it's extraordinarily important to get it right. So, you know, the two things you want to avoid is you want to avoid a sort of big society story where everyone just presumes the state has to do nothing, and then, you know, gloriously community groups will fill the void. And we saw that, those of us who are old enough, you know, saw that in the early Cameron Osborne years, and it just doesn't work. On the other hand, you don't want the sort of, you know, the high point of social democracy either, you know, as in perhaps bits of the 50s, 60s and 70s, where government is trying to do everything, you know, and trying to provide the sorts of services that are much better provided by people who are in touch locally and sort of open to participatory experiment. Now, it shouldn't be beyond the wit of people like us to come up with that balance and to work out, you know, what does government need to do and what do community groups need to do themselves. But it has proven really difficult, I think, is the truth. You know, people tend to flock to one side or the other of that, you know, sort of distinction, rather than finding the happy balance which we need. But, you know, in addition to your brilliant piece of research, I noticed that Ed Wallace from Locality has got a great pamphlet out with the Fabians this week on precisely this issue. So those of you who haven't read that yet, I recommend Ed's pamphlet very warmly.
Thanks, Mark. And Deborah, I don't know if you've got reflections on that, or maybe how it pertains to campaign strategy and the way parties engage, and again, do you see opportunities, limitations with engagement at that sort of level?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted actually to make a sort of slightly different but related point, because I think that what we're talking about, and I know this isn't necessarily your bailiwick, but I think it applies to national policy making as well as local policy making, arguably more, if anything, because people are more likely to be detached from that than they are to what's going on in their local community. And, you know, to my mind, this makes the case for something I've always been a fan of, which is deliberative democracy in its various forms. Because I think the more that you can involve people in the decisions that affect their lives, whether they're at a local level or at a national level, the better those decisions will be, the more buy-in you'll get. And actually, the more you can build trust in the process, because I think what happens is the start point. I've written down the book you recommended, Mark, Undivided, because it sounds great. And I absolutely agree about politics turning into a sort of spectator sport, and frankly, not a terribly good one at that. And I think, you know, that the trust breakdown we've talked about comes from people having a very poor understanding of what politicians do. And the truth is, most politicians are not bad people. Most politicians go into politics with very good intentions. You might not agree with everything they want to do, but they're not going in to do something damaging or to feather their own nests or do all the things that people might presume. And they are then, particularly when they're in government, they are faced with a lot of very difficult decisions, and they are doing their best to navigate those. And people often are very unaware of that process and unaware of the trade-offs that they are facing. And I think in a way, one of the advantages of involving people in that decision making in some way is that they become aware of, you know, of the goodwill that politicians are bringing to the process too. So it's kind of win-win.
Great, thank you, Deborah. Mark, I'm going to come to you for slightly longer reflections now, and I think we've touched on this a bit already, particularly that point you made around kind of spectacle rather than participation. But I think really what this paper highlights is a tension between a government focused on delivery and the emotional storytelling that resonates with communities. Is that something that you think this government faces, that challenge, and how might they navigate it?
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, as the the report says, it's sort of grounded in that observation of Peter Mayer 2 decades ago or what have you, which is that increasingly our professional politicians, just by force of circumstance, as Deborah rightly says, not by force of desire or personality, they end up living in a different kind of world with different sorts of concerns than the vast majority of the population. And if you continue in that way, where you have a small number of people reading the small number of websites or talking to a small number of journalists about a small number of things, then it's not surprising that they start to speak in their own jargon or technical speak, or that they have a kind of understanding of the world which is mediated by the last meeting they went to in Portcullis House rather than by the sort of beating heart concerns of the country, not by choice, not by desire, but just by the way that our system has developed and evolved over time. And I think that what's remarkable for me as I get older is just how long we've been concerned with this theme and how many sort of false dawns there have been. So I think right at the start of this century we were beginning to think that perhaps our political class were separated out too much from sort of everyday people's concerns and language and style and associational loyalties, and that's when people like Peter Mayer started writing about this kind of issue, and it crept onto curriculums in universities and training courses for politicians, etc. And then there was a sort of brief hope, I think, after the financial crisis that the shock to the system might generate a new kind of politics. And you had Barack Obama, who suddenly found his voice and a rhetorical style that did connect and did excite people, and the language of sort of community engagement, or yes we can, or you are the change you've been waiting for, sort of resonated. And I will always remember talking to a very sort of gnarly and skeptical and cynical American political scientist who was swept away by Obama, right back in the 2008, because he said he turned on the little TV in his Manhattan apartment kitchen, was making himself his cornflakes, and was just heard Obama's speech when he had lost the first primary, and just said he put down the cornflakes and just couldn't stop listening. He was kind of swept away. So there have been moments at which we felt as if connection was going to take place again, and our political leaders were going to be able to talk to the public in a language which they found emotionally resonant or exciting. It's just that every time that there's been that dawn, it's sort of drifted, and it hasn't been maintained. And I had a very small example of that when I was working for Ed. We had down days and we had high days, and in 2012 I wrote a speech for Ed on the idea of one nation, which really resonated and worked extremely well. But it filtered, sort of petered out after 2 or 3 days, and before you knew it, you were back to where we ended up being in 2015. So I think people are, to summarize all that, people are conscious of the challenge, this need to emotionally resonate with a country who are skeptical, distrusting, challenged, but also who feel separated out from their political leaders. I think that there are very few people in politics who don't understand that that is a paramount challenge that we need to address. And yet we've failed, I think, consistently failed to find the way of addressing it over time. As I said, there've been brief flickerings of an answer, but then they've always sort of got blown out. And so I do think it's the thing that we ought to address ourselves to. And you've seen it too, I think. I mean, Deborah might have different views, but I think you've seen it in the story of this government. I was lucky enough to be at Tate Modern on the night of the election, and Keir's address to the crowd there was extremely moving. And I think his words on the steps of Downing Street the next day also hit exactly the right tone, ideas of respect and of service and of a government speaking for its people and working for its people again. But it's not easy, obviously, to hold on to that, and much of government communication since then hasn't had that warmth or that resonance or that style. And I know if you do focus groups now on many sort of clips that leading government spokespeople do, or opposition spokespeople, then what the electorate will say is that they feel as if they're talking in a strangulated language that they don't understand about issues that matter to them, and not issues that matter to the country. I saw the Chancellor yesterday having to try to give a clip to the ITV News, I think it was, and trying to talk up the economic success stories of the government. And that she, I don't blame her at all. She's playing a particular game. You have to land your one sentence on the ITV News, but in so doing, you end up speaking in a way which we know doesn't quicken the pulse for the vast majority of the public. In fact, probably has the opposite effect. So, I guess in summary, I'd say, what we want to do is two things. We want to stop politics just being a spectacle in the way that Charlotte and Deborah have talked about, give real opportunities for participation and engagement. And insofar as it remains a spectacle where we have to listen to our leaders speak on the TV or, in those church halls or at conferences, we want to try to get them to speak in a tone and in a language which is genuinely resonant with the public and talks directly to their concerns, is grounded in the ordinary, not in the sort of hyperbolic political language that we've been sort of so used to. Nobody believes that, we're going to transform everything overnight. So it'd be great for our political class to stop claiming that we can.
Great. Thank you, Mark. So we've got roughly 15 minutes left and have had quite a few questions coming in via the chat. So thank you everyone for that. I'm going to do my best to work through a few of these. I don't know if we'll have time for all of them. And I'm going to start off with one from Rob McMillan, which is a really important point around the fact that political parties aren't single monoliths driven only from the centre. And wondered whether people have reflections on local party members and branches' activity in the alternative conception of local politics that, Linda, you were chatting through. I don't know, Charlotte, whether you might want to reflect on that, and maybe Deborah, having been involved in kind of central party thinking about local party activists as well. But Charlotte, yeah, any reflections on kind of how you might engage with local political parties in Shropshire?
Yeah, it's been quite interesting in Shropshire because we've gone Lib Dem for the first time. From our by-election a few years ago, our MP became Lib Dem, Helen Morgan, and now the whole county's gone Lib Dem, and for the first time we've got a council which is majority Lib Dem, which has never happened before. And I think that is entirely because Helen Morgan, as our Lib Dem MP, talks to people. She goes round, she spends a lot of time visiting communities, speaking to everybody, actively listening, sharing those concerns in Westminster and evidencing that she shared those concerns at Westminster. And as a result, people have then trusted the Lib Dem party much wider. But without a shadow of a doubt, it's because of her work over the last few years, building relationships up with people and building trust up within the community that has generated that change. And we've not seen that from any other party in Shropshire to the same way that we've seen that from the Helen Morgan specifically. And so I think that has been evidenced by the clear shift in the vote, which has just never gone that way before. In Shropshire as a rural community, it's always been conservative, and Conservatives and Reform then did hold, but Lib Dems in many places just smashed it all to pieces.
Right, thanks, Charlotte. Feels like that might be living encapsulation of a recent Kemi Badenoch swipe at the Liberal Democrats, being more focused on those sorts of local issues. I wonder, Deborah, having been involved in kind of campaign strategy for the Labour Party, how much thought was given to the local branches and local party activists in engaging in this sort of activity with associational organisations?
Yeah, I mean, loads, but I mean, let's be realistic. In the end, if you're running a massive campaign, you have to have some discipline, and it does have to be, I think, led from the centre. But then you need to allow people to sort of translate some of those things into whatever is appropriate for them locally. And well, I always said at the beginning, I mean, I think there is a real role for local activists doing, frankly, less talking and more doing, out in the community, doing the things that matter. I mean, to Charlotte's point about the Lib Dems, I mean, without wanting to be unkind, I think it's kind of like a slightly easier thing for Lib Dems to do on the basis that they are not in government and frankly not likely to be in government. And so, your MP is obviously doing a brilliant job in the local community, and good on her. And everybody should be doing that as much as they can. But realistically, what she's not doing is then translating that into how we govern our country, because she doesn't have that power and isn't likely to in the short term. I mean, I don't want to pour cold water on it, but that is the reality. But yeah, I mean, I think locally, the more, MPs are elected to represent an area, and the more that they connect with that area, the better. I'd like to see them spending less time in Westminster and more time in their constituencies.
Great, thank you, Deborah. We've had a question here from John, which I might pose to either Josh or Linda, and as came up somewhere else as well, which is, so we've been speaking a lot about community involvement and how vital that is for democracy. But John was kind of posing this concern that sometimes that means loudest voices getting attention or leading to decisions being made on behalf of the loudest voices. And he highlights things like fighting against building projects, renewable energy projects. So how do we make this community involvement accountable and representative? And how do we ensure it's not just the loudest voices that are heard? And Charlotte, you might want to reflect on this as well. But yeah, I don't know, Josh, if you wanted to start on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's a good question. It's one that comes up in a lot of policy discussions related to kind of community empowerment, and I think it's a fair one. I mean, like, ultimately, we need to find a way either through policy or process that it isn't just a loud minority that is heard when it comes to decisions around planning or infrastructure. I think there is a case that part of broadening that out, it would be assisted by doing kind of proper engagement with these types of organizations that tend to have roots into lots of different parts of the community, and particularly places that local government often struggles to reach as well. And there's some good research by locality on that point. I guess the one thing that I would add to that is that politics at all levels is about disagreement, right? So it's not a bad thing that people are going to kind of have this argument about decisions being made in their local area. I think the point that we're making is that if we can have that kind of discussion in a civil, productive way that people feel welcome into, that would be a good thing, both locally, but also adds up to something nationally as well.
Thank you, Josh. Charlotte, I don't know if there's anything you want to add from the kind of Covenant experience, and I know you've
I mean, it is an interesting point. I think it is always a struggle. I think those that feel the most disempowered aren't suddenly going to be empowered by any structure or legislative change or anything that's suddenly put in place. It has to be a journey. And I think Josh's point actually is really valid in the fact that I think the start of that journey is the organisations or groups that they're a member of or part of. If those groups start to have a voice, it starts to give that individual more of a voice, and it starts to take them on that journey of empowerment. And I think, and that's the route that we've taken with the Community Covenant, is we've understood that getting some of those people to come into that covenant space is too much of a leap for them. But actually, if we're working with, if the people in that covenant space represent some of the organisations that they're a member of, and their voice is feeding in that way, then actually they start to get quite excited about it. But they're still not comfortable yet to come into the space. But it is about providing opportunities, I think, for that journey. And the further down or the closer to communities decision making can be made, the more listening can be had from those individuals and communities, and the more empowerment you get. And that kind of, the problems start to ease, but they're not going to go away quickly. They're always going to be there. And I think it's a case of putting the right processes in place to ensure that journey can be facilitated and those people can be listened to.
Right. Thank you, Charlotte. Got a question here from Kate in the chat, which I think is a really interesting one, which is particularly around time. So kind of engaging in these sorts of things is something that requires people to have the time and capacity to do so. And Kate mentioned kind of particularly from the perspective of people in middle age with working or caring responsibilities, and I think that's borne out in the data that Josh shared from the polling, that there was this kind of U-shaped curve where people's participation dropped in middle age. Deborah, you mentioned this kind of idea of tax breaks for companies which provide people time to get involved in things like this. I'm wondering do others on the panel have other ideas on how best to tackle that? Are there other routes in for people to this sort of thing, particularly when they're time stretched, or ways that we can create that time for people? Mark, I wonder, I might come to you first, and then Deborah, if there's anything to build on that idea you had on the tax breaks idea.
No, absolutely. It's a really important question. And I mean, as I mentioned in chatting to the research team a little bit a few weeks ago, it surprised me the steepness of that U distribution here in the UK, because when we did similar work in Australia, we didn't find that. So we found that people who were in sort of, had young children or had older people they were looking after were actually more associationally active. And I've been pondering why that was. And one hypothesis, but we haven't tested it yet, but one hypothesis would be you need to have participatory opportunities in the institutions and organizations that people at that stage of life are part of. So you want more active parent-teacher possibilities, for example, for those with kids in primary or secondary schools. You want more active opportunities for working people, through whether it be through trade unions or through other kinds of organizations within the workplace. So you need a kind of structured participatory opportunity which is designed for people at different stages in the life cycle, rather than what I think your research indicates we might have here in Britain, which are fantastic club-like opportunities for people in the earlier part of their life and the later part of their life, and then nothing sort of going on when you're busy. So, designing participatory opportunities for busy people in midlife would seem to be a really productive thing for many of those on the call to be thinking about how we do. And I don't, again, as I say, don't think it's rocket science. I think just, making sure that all parents can be easily part of a PTA, not just the sort of, the people who usually are part of those PTAs, probably me, and then thinking about what, workplace opportunities might be, works councils, trade unions, etc., could be a way forward.
Lovely, thanks, Mark. Anything to add to that, Deborah?
Yeah, I mean, I actually do think it's sort of rocket science. I do think this is the most difficult thing, because I think if you look at the people who are least likely to get involved, they're going back, the disengaged battlers or whatever they called them in their segmentation, these are the people that I've had in focus groups in Germany, in the US, in here. The problem is that they can't make ends meet doing just one job. They're doing multiple jobs again and again and again. I've heard this story of people working, in the gig economy or whatever, and they just don't have time. And time is money. They can't afford to do it. So I think it is really hard, which is why maybe tax breaks from, so you can take time off work and still be paid to do it is one way, or involving people in a way that the state involves them and funds them to doing it, because that's also the way you get around the loudest voice problem. Because, with the best of the world, there's no point in people on this call turning up to take part. We do it anyway. We always do it. Nobody cares what we think. We want to know what the people who wouldn't turn up think.
Yeah, really good point. Thank you. And I know Mark has to head off because he is organising his own event. So we'll say bye to Mark, but we've got a couple of minutes to wrap things up from our end. There was one other question which I think just builds really nicely on the point you were making, Deborah, from Sasha in the chat. He cited some RSA research which highlights the kind of connection between social connection and upward social mobility. So I think it was research that kind of mirrors some work that was done in the US that shows the kind of networks that we have help us increase earnings over a lifetime. And so I think, Deborah, maybe kind of just a question back to you on whether you see a link between social connection, social mobility, and trust in politics, whether that's one of the things that we are missing maybe from some of the earlier discussion, is that social mobility point and earning power that people, so vital to people's lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think what's been lost, and it's probably all connected, although I'm not entirely sure how, is the sense that people can improve their lot. People generally think things have got worse rather than things have got better, and they feel more pessimistic for their children rather than optimistic. That wasn't the case a generation ago. And these are very big questions that in the end, only by getting growth in the economy and by, improving the economy can we address those, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I'm gonna, just in the interest of time and knowing that people are busy, I'm gonna do a quick attempt at wrapping up. And before I do that, just to say thanks so much to Josh and Linda for their presentation on the research and all the work that they did to do that research. Also, thank you to Charlotte and Deborah and Mark, who's now left us, for contributions today. I found this a really interesting discussion. I guess just to kind of fill people in on what we're doing at Power to Change. So I mentioned that this is a piece of research which is part of our community power strand of work. So we're involved in lots of different things, which are all really trying to dig into that question of how we empower communities to play a bigger role in our social and national life. We're doing some of the work that Charlotte mentioned, working alongside Charlotte in Shropshire to test this idea of community covenants. We're working alongside a whole coalition of national organisations and community leaders to push for the devolution agenda that's being brought forward by this government to be one that has community empowerment at its heart, and will be continuing to do that over the remainder of this year. And we're also thinking about kind of what comes next from a research point of view. So I think this discussion, where some of the questions, particularly some of those that you were posing, Deborah, of areas for further research, and particularly that question around how you reach the disengaged, I think is one that's a really fascinating one. And I think there is also something that feels really important about the kind of lack of hope that you spoke about, Deborah, and the way that kind of pervades a lot of our politics at the moment, and thinking about how some of this might be able to start giving people a more hopeful sight of a more hopeful future. So we will stay in touch with everyone that's been part of this call. Really appreciate people tuning in. Appreciate you asking questions, and yeah, we'll make sure we share more on the research and share more on what we're up to next in this strand of work at Power to Change. So I'll leave it there and say thanks everyone for coming, and enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Thank you.